All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our candidate information session. My name is Kim Gaglione, and I'm the Senior Manager of Legislative Services. And tonight we have our election team, who you met a couple at the door. They're just trying to get everybody organized, but being cognizant of everybody's time on a Friday evening, we'd like to get this process going, and then everybody can actually have a Friday evening when we're done. The election team consists of Andrea Zampieri. She's the person you're most likely to see and talk to. Andrea is our election coordinator, and she's a fountain of information, so you'll know who to be asking questions of if you need to. We'll try and provide you a lot of the information so that you can be independent and know where to go and find things. The ministry is going to cover a lot of, oh, I'm sorry, I missed our sign expert, who will also give you a little bit of information this evening, John Maddox. The ministry is here this evening, and we're going to follow an agenda briefly, having them speak to everything that is concerning you if you want to run for council and the rules you need to be following. And after that, we'll just run through some information relating to Oakville only. So from the ministry, we have Sean and Joan. They have great last names, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they get up to speak, and then I don't mess up their last names. So I'm going to welcome them forward now, and they'll speak. If you have questions, please raise your hand at the time throughout the session. However, we will have a question and answer period at the end of the session this evening. So, Sean, you're up first. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Good afternoon, everybody. As Kim said, my name is Sean Fay. Joining along with me from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs is my colleague, Joan Egwanwu. I want to start by thanking Andrea, Kim, and Vicky and the election staff for inviting us out today to provide our candidate information presentation. Joan and I are municipal advisors from the Central Municipal Service Office. For those of you who don't know what a municipal advisor does, we work closely with municipalities. We provide education and outreach with regards to provincial programs and legislation, which is part of what we're here today to do, but more specifically around changes to the Municipal Election Act. Just a few quick housekeeping items. I know Kim had said to ask questions during the presentation, but if possible, if we can hold off till the end and get through all of the content, that would be best. Some of your questions may be answered based on the slides and the information we provide. So yes, if we could do that, that would be fantastic. Also, as a side note, you will see that even on the front slide there that it refers to third-party advertisers. This presentation is specifically for candidates, so we will only speaking to the candidate info. Regulation of third-party advertisers is something new this time around for the 2018 election. We'll give you some brief information around that, things that you would want to know as a candidate, but otherwise we're going to skip over those third-party advertising slides. This is the ministry's lovely usual disclaimer that we provide. I'm sure Oakville staff have seen it many times before in our presentation decks. The slides we're presenting are for information purposes only. They're not to be considered legal advice. Joan and I are not lawyers, so we recommend that if you do have questions, you seek either the legislation or legal counsel when necessary. We won't be able to cover every aspect of the municipal election, but we're hoping that the information that we do provide gives you a better understanding and a better comfort level with all of the changes. Okay, so this slide outlines some of the topics we're going to cover for this session. They include roles of elected members of council, head of council, municipal staff, and school board trustees. We're going to look at the nomination process and how a candidate withdraws a nomination. Also, what happens if a candidate files a nomination and then changes his or her mind about the office they wish to run for. We'll look at some key dates, who is eligible to run for municipal office and school boards and who is not. Look at general campaign rules and election finances. So this includes things like campaign spending limits, contribution limits, campaign expenses, borrowing, what expenses are exempt from the spending limit. finances, including surpluses and deficits, financial reporting at the end of your campaign period. We are also going to look at the compliance audits initiated by an application. We'll look at the penalties, general information about the voters list and rules about proxy voting, the rights of scrutineers at the poll, recounts, and finally we have resources, so where you can find some good information, and we'll refer to that resources slide throughout the presentation. So obviously a lot to cover. We will try to get you out of here in a timely manner, but we also want to get through all this information clearly, so just bear with us for a lot of it. Okay, so why run for office? Local government is the level of government that is closest to the people, it's the most accessible, and it's the most responsive to the needs of the community. So you've made the decision to throw your hat in the ring, or you're just interested in the process. Perhaps it's something you've always wanted to do. You want to make a difference, you have an interest in politics, whatever the reason is. It is a 4-year commitment. It's going to be filled with challenges, excitement, hard work, and hopefully a great deal of satisfaction. All right, so looking at the role of council, the role of council is set out in section 224 of the Municipal Act. By the way, if you need to look up any sections of the legislation, you can refer to e-laws online. Our resources slide at the end has a link to e-laws. What I like to do is even if you go to Google and you type in the legislation you're looking for, usually e-laws is the first thing to pop up, so that's one of the easiest ways to get there. So it is the role of council to represent the public and consider the well-being and interests of the municipality, develop and evaluate policies and programs of the municipality, determine which services the municipality provides, and ensure that administration and controllership policies, practices, and procedures are in place to implement the decisions of council. So still looking at the role of council, it's the role of council to ensure the accountability and transparency operations of a municipality. This is something that's particularly important, especially around this election, considering the changes that have come out of Bill 68, a key theme of which was accountability and transparency. So municipalities will be required to have things like a mandatory code of conduct, access to an integrity commissioner. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's just something that I like to note because I want everyone to be aware of that. It'll be particularly important for the next council. Council also must maintain the financial integrity of the municipality, as well as carry out duties of council under the Municipal Act and many other pieces of legislation. Okay, still with the role of council. It is the role of council to conduct meetings, pass bylaws, develop policies with respect to those items listed there on the slide. I won't read through them all. This is done as a collective group, with all members each having one vote. Once council has made a collective decision, it is municipal staff's duty to implement those decisions. At the ministry, we consider municipalities to be responsible and accountable governments with respect to matters within their jurisdiction. And each municipality is given powers and duties under the Municipal Act and many other acts for the purpose of providing good government with respect to those matters. This is something that we typically say at the ministry, so it's important to keep in mind. And just as a quick note, the 3 policies at the very bottom of the slides, the one with the asterisks there, those policies will come into effect on March 1st, 2019. So the role of the head of council, along with what is listed on the slide, the role of the head of council is to act as the leader, and they are the chair of the meetings of council, and they're the public face of the municipality. So although the legislation refers to the council as the chief executive officer, this is sometimes confusing for some people who may have a business background. It is not the same as the CEO of a company. The head of council actually has very few powers that can be exercised independently from council. So except where specifically delegated in cases of an emergency or in the context of procedure matters in council meeting, the head of council has no greater power than any individual council member. It's important to note that council makes decision as a whole, which we've already mentioned. To clarify, the head of council only has one vote. There's sometimes confusion from the point of the media and the public who think that the head of council can only vote in the event of a tie. And another clarification regarding voting, refraining from voting, it counts as a no vote, and this is spelled out specifically in the legislation. So in cases where there's recorded votes, a tie loses. So the result is the same as having voted no. Looking at the role of municipal staff, so again, in addition to what's listed there on the slide, there are municipal statutory officers who have some duties and responsibilities that is described in the legislation. So someone like the clerk, for instance, these duties cannot be changed or limited by council. And generally the role of staff is to support council and to operate the business of the municipality within the framework that is provided by council. Council sets the policy direction and staff implements that direction. So this is just really a summary slide that it repeats some of the things that I've previously mentioned. So it's good if you just want to look at some of the information I've provided at a quick glance. You can use that slide. Looking at the role of the school board trustee, the Education Act creates 4 different kinds of school boards, and they're listed up there on the slide. School trustees are members of the school board. They are locally elected representatives of the public, and they're the community's advocate for public education. Only the team, i.e. the board, not an individual trustee, has the authority to make decisions or take action. And a trustee is often the first point of contact for the community and members who have questions or concerns about their local school. Candidates should contact the applicable school board for further information about duties, commitments, etc. So continuing with the role of the school board trustee, it's the role of the school board trustee to establish policy direction. They participate in making decisions that benefit the entire school board while also representing the interests of constituents. And they have to be accountable to constituents, Ministry of Education, families, and the community. So during this presentation, I will be alternating with my colleague Joan here. She's going to take over for this section. She's going to look at the eligibility to run for a municipal office. And then I will come back to talk about more of the finance-related matters.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. My name again is John Egwong. I'm a colleague of Sean. We're both municipal advisor. So now that we know the role of the head of council, the role of council, and also the role of municipal staff, let's look at some of the eligibility criteria. So who can run for office and who can't run for office? So a person is entitled to be an elector at an election held in a local municipality if on voting day, he or she is an eligible elector. So some of the criteria we have on the slide is, the first one is that as a candidate, you have to reside in the local municipality, or you are the owner or tenant of land, and also either you or your spouse is also an owner of a land or a tenant in the municipality. So that qualifies you to run for office. Also, you have to be a Canadian citizen. You have to be 18 years old or older. You have to not, so you shouldn't have any legal prohibition from voting in office. Also, the candidate should not be disqualified by any legislation from holding a municipal office. And who is not eligible to run for office? Any person not eligible to vote in the municipality, an employee of the municipality, unless a leave of absence is taken before nomination, and if the employee wins, they must resign. A judge of any court, a member of the Ontario Legislature, Senate, or House of Commons, a person who was a candidate in the previous election but did not file their campaign financial statement by the deadline, Also, Section 30 of the Municipal Election Act states that a person shall not be considered an employee for this section by reason only of being a volunteer firefighter, as defined in the Fire Protection and Prevention Act. So who is eligible to run for a school board trustee? A resident within the jurisdiction of the school board, eligible to vote for school board election. Also, the candidate, on the day the candidate files a nomination, they must be a Canadian citizen, 18 years or older. They must meet any other qualification to vote for school board. So for example, being a Roman Catholic, or you hold a French language rights. And who is not eligible to run for the school board trustee? Any person who is not eligible to vote for the school board. An employee of any school board who has not taken an unpaid leave of absence. A municipal official, a judge of any court, a member of the Ontario Legislature, House of Commons, or Senate. A person who was a candidate in the previous election but did not file their campaign financial statement by the deadline. I know my colleague mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that although the presentation today, what we have is both for candidates and third-party advertisers, we're not going to be going into talking about third-party advertising, but I'm just going to provide a little information about third-party advertiser that applies to candidates. So, first of all, the third-party advertising rule came into effect April 1st, 2018, and the third-party advertising framework intends to introduce a level of fairness and accountability around third-party advertising. Keep in mind that third-party advertising activities has always been going on in previous elections. However, the province is regulating the activities of third-party advertisers in this 2018 election. So who is a third-party advertiser? An individual, a corporation, or trade union who is registered in the municipality to promote, support, or oppose a candidate or a yes or no question on the ballot. And what is third-party advertisement? That means an advertisement in any broadcast, print, electronic, or other medium that has the purpose of promoting, supporting, or opposing a candidate or a yes or no question on the ballot. Something you have to keep in mind as a candidate is that third-party advertising is separate from any candidate's campaign and must be done independently from a candidate. So as a candidate, you cannot influence the activities of a third-party advertiser. So that's just the part we would like you to be aware of. So I'm going to skip the two slides and continue on the nomination process. Nominations can be submitted beginning Tuesday, May 1st. So there are several forms that you will have to use during the whole election period. And most of these the forms are already available. You can get them from your clerk. Another way you can have access to these forms is through the candidate's guide. So the candidate's guide, at the end of the slide, we have a slide that has a lot of resources. So we have some links there. So if you click on the ministry's link, it will take you to the page where you will find the candidate's guide. So from the candidate's guide, we have all the forms. So you just click on the various links and you're able to print out those forms. But again, you can get those forms from your clerk. So the nomination form is Form 1. So that is what you will need to submit to file your nomination, and that will start May 1st of this year. Nomination day is Friday, July 27th, beginning from the normal municipality's office hour, which is between 9 and 2 p.m. And this is a shortened nomination period from past election. Withdrawal of a nomination must be filed with the clerk's office in writing before 2 p.m. on nomination day. Local election policies may state that a candidate must personally attend the clerk's office to withdraw candidacy. However, if a candidate is in the hospital or incapacitated, this might not be feasible. It is recommended that a candidate personally attend at the clerk's office to withdraw a nomination. Clerks must certify nominations by 4 p.m. on Monday following nomination day, and that will be July 30th of this year. If a candidate withdraws a nomination, so you file your nomination and then you decide to withdraw your nomination, you are still required to file your campaign financial statement by the deadline. And this has to cover all the financial transactions you made before you decide to withdraw your nomination. An issue that is raised infrequently, but is of importance nonetheless, is what happens. So you file your nomination and then you decide to run for another office. So again, I'll refer you to the candidate's guide, because there's a lot of information in the candidate's guide with a lot of examples to some of the questions you might have. So that would be a very good resource for you to read. So if you file a nomination and then you decide to run for another office, the ministry has provided a lot of examples in the candidate's guide. More on the nomination process. Candidates must file Form 1, which is the nomination paper, and submit it to the municipal clerk with a filing fee. So for the head of council or the mayor, the filing fee is $200, and for all other offices, $100. And this amount can be paid in cash, certified check, or money order payable to the municipality. Also, the clerk can also specify other electronic means by which you can make this payment. The clerk may require candidates to show proof of eligibility or fill out a declaration that the candidate is eligible to run for office. So in a ward system, an eligible voter in the municipality may run in the ward, in any ward, sorry. The 25 signature requirement. So this, again, is a new requirement in this election. So the 25 signature requirement, so any municipal, if you're running for a municipal council, you're required to provide 25 signatures. And that will be in Form 2. So like I said, again, there are several forms you need to use during this whole process. So Form 2 is the form you will use to provide the 25 signatures. So the requirement for nominators to sign nomination forms does not apply to school board trustees. So it's just for municipal candidates. Nominators can nominate more than one candidate and are not required to vote for that candidate. So anybody can nominate you, but they are not required. They don't have to vote for you. In a ward system, the nominator can be anyone who is eligible to vote in the municipality, not just the ward. Both the clerk and the candidate are entitled to rely upon the nominator providing the information. So the 25 signatures, both the clerk and the candidate, they have to rely upon the nominator to prove that they are eligible. So it's on the nominators, it's the nominator that has to, that is signing, has to prove that they are eligible. The clerk or the candidate will rely upon them to do that. If the nominator did not meet the eligibility requirements when they signed the document, then they could be held accountable under the penalty section of the Municipal Act. So if, as a candidate, if you wish, you can get more than 25 signatures. So you don't just have to bring 25 signatures. You can collect more than 25 signatures. So as I mentioned earlier, if you file your nomination and then you change your mind, you want to run for another office, you can do that, and this slide speaks to that. So occasionally a candidate changes their mind and decides to run for a different office. That is allowed, but however, keep in mind that you can only run for one office at a time. If a candidate files a second nomination, the first nomination is deemed to be withdrawn. If a candidate decides to run for another office and they have already collected the 25 signatures, they can use these endorsement signatures for the other office. If a candidate decides to run, in an at-large voting system, if a candidate decides to run for a different office on the same council or school board, and both positions are elected at large, everything from the first campaign is transferred to the second campaign, and only one financial statement you have to file only one financial statement. However, in the ward system, if the candidate decides to run for a different office on the same council or school board, and one or both offices are elected by the ward system, the two campaigns must be kept separate, and you have to file two separate financial statements. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Sean to walk us through the whole general election campaign finance rules.
Thanks, Joan. Okay. So as Joan said, this is we're getting to into the finance-heavy portion of the presentation. I'm just going to reiterate what I said at the beginning. There are references to third-party advertisers in there. We're only speaking about the information that's pertinent to candidates. It's in there because generally a lot of the same rules that apply to candidates apply to third-party advertisers. But yes, only speaking towards candidate information. Okay, so campaign accounts, they are only required if a candidate raises or spends money. So for situations where it's an acclamation or no funds were raised or spent, there is no need to open up that campaign account. Trade unions and corporations, they're no longer eligible to contribute to a candidate's campaign, although they can participate as third-party advertisers or contribute to a third-party advertiser. There is a new policy that requires, as required on the use of municipal corporate resources for municipalities and local boards. This must be passed by May 1st in the year of the election, and it's intended to encourage more accountability and transparency in the municipality. The practice of municipalities providing candidate contact information on their websites, that is not considered a contribution. Contributions from the candidate and their spouse are considered to have come from the same person, and they count against the self-contribution limit or self-funding limit, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. The rules for determining whether corporations are considered to be one contributor, they're clarified up there on the slide. So if one corporation controls the others directly or indirectly, then they are considered to be the same contributor. If the corporations are owned or controlled by the same person or groups of persons, either directly or indirectly, they are considered to be the same contributor. Keep in mind, though, they cannot contribute to a candidate's campaign. Candidates cannot accept contributions from the following: federal political party, provincial political party, federal or provincial government, a municipality, a school board, and a business or group that is not a corporation. Something to keep in mind about volunteers and contributions: the value of services provided by a volunteer is generally not considered to be a contribution. However, if that volunteer does that in a professional capacity, meaning they would regularly get paid for that service, then it must be recorded as a contribution by the volunteer in your campaign expenses. So if someone is doing marketing for you and they regularly do that in their professional capacity, then that would be an example of a professional volunteer. Continuing with contributions, campaign contributions, they are monies, goods, or services given to a candidate or his or her election for his or her election campaign Cash contributions, they may be accepted up to $25. Contributions more than $25 must be made by check, money order, or by a method that clearly shows where the funds came from. And fundraising functions are events or activities held by or on behalf of a candidate for the purposes of raising money for that candidate's campaign. And the price of admission to a fundraiser is a campaign contribution, and a receipt must be provided for the full amount. Receipts must be issued for every contribution, and they should show the name, address, amount, and the date. Okay, so contribution limit. So this would be what an individual could contribute to a candidate's campaign. The individual contribution amount has increased from $750 to $1,200, but the aggregate amount of $5,000 stays the same. So if there's a number of candidates in the room, I could contribute, $1,200 to one, $1,200 to one, until you reach the aggregate amount of $5,000. Since candidates are required to inform contributors of the contribution limits, you may want to include those limits on the receipts that you provide to those contributors. Okay, so self-funding limit, as I said, we would talk about this. Self-funding limit for municipal council candidates is based on the number of electors voting for the office, and it's to a maximum of $25,000 per candidate. So the formula for calculating the limit is $7,500 plus 20 cents per elector for head of council, and it's $5,000 plus 20 cents per elector for all other council offices. And as just mentioned, the highest self-funding amount that anyone can possibly have is $25,000. So if the formula works out to a number that is over $25,000, then you would use $25,000. If the formula works out to something that is less than $25,000, then you would use whatever the formula works out to. There is no self-funding limit for school board candidates, though. Okay, looking at borrowing. While candidates can open their campaign accounts with their own funds, they cannot loan funds to their campaign to kickstart it with the intention of getting it all back. So the only way that a candidate can reclaim that startup amount is after the campaign period ends and prior to filing the financial statements. So the candidate or his or her spouse, they can be refunded that contribution from the surplus. And we're going to talk about the surplus a little bit later, closer to the end of the presentation. You can't receive a loan from family members or from any corporate accounts that you have access to. And the loan isn't to be considered campaign income, and paying it back is not a campaign expense. But if you or your spouse guarantee the loan and then the campaign does not repay all of that loan, the remaining balance of that loan would be considered a contribution to your campaign. So looking at expenses, so for the purposes of the Municipal Elections Act, the following are considered campaign expenses. The slide doesn't really list them all. For your reference, if you want to see the list, it's section 88.19 of the Municipal Elections Act. I can read through it now, though. So the replacement value of goods retained by the person, individual, corporation, or trade union from any previous election in the municipality and used in the current election. So really the only one relevant there would be the person or the individual. The value of contributions of goods and services, audit and accounting fees, interest on loans, the cost of holding fundraising functions, the cost of holding parties or expressions of appreciation after the close of voting, expenses related to a compliance audit, which we'll talk about later, expenses that are incurred by a candidate with a disability, which they incurred directly in relation to the election, and the cost of election campaign advertisements. Still with campaign expenses, so candidates, they should become familiar with the campaign expense provisions. Campaign expenses are those costs incurred by a candidate or on a candidate's behalf during his or her campaign. The nomination filing fee is no longer considered an expense, and it doesn't have to be included in the financial disclosure forms. Goods and services donated to a campaign are also expenses, and they must be reported, and a receipt must be provided for the fair market value of that goods or service. Only nominated persons can incur expenses during the campaign period. Payment of any campaign expenses must be drawn from the campaign account, and a receipt providing the details and proof of payment must be obtained. All expenses must be reported in the relevant financial disclosure forms to be filed by the candidate with the clerk. So this would be Form 4. Joan had already mentioned the best way to look up those forms. If you're going to go through the ministry's website, you should go through the candidate's guide, but it is also available on Oakville's website too. So regarding campaign inventory, if you ran in the last election and you want to use leftover goods such as signs or office supplies that you might have, you have to determine what the current market value of those goods would be and what it would cost to purchase them today. And these amounts are recorded as an expense on the financial disclosure forms, or Form 4. Conversely, if you end up with leftover inventory at the end of your campaign and then it becomes your personal property, but you want to store it again, say for another election in the future, the cost of storage is not considered a campaign expense. Deficits from prior campaigns, they're no longer carried forward after the 2018 election, so any deficits that you incur from the 2018, they're going to become the responsibility of the candidate. The costs associated with an auditor's report for campaigns are campaign expenses. Campaigns related to preparation of an auditor's report that accompanies the financial statements can be incurred after December 31st. Just note that this is a specific exemption for the auditor's report. Any expenses related to something like compliance audits or recounts, they would require an extension and a supplemental filing of your financial disclosure form. And this might be made clear once we talk more about compliance audit and recounts. Another note, an auditor's report is not required if the total contributions received and total expenses incurred during the election campaign are each equal to or less than $10,000. Okay, looking at spending limits. So the spending limit for candidates and the maximum amount for parties and expressions of appreciation after voting day, they're set out in Ontario Regulation 101.97. So for heads of council, it's $7,500 plus 85 cents per elector. And then for all other offices, it's $5,000 plus 85 cents per elector. And the maximum amount for parties and expressions of appreciation after voting, it's 10% of the calculated formulas that I just mentioned. The clerk calculates the spending limit twice. So upon candidate filing their nomination form, so at that time the clerk will provide the spending limit based on the number of electors on the voters list as it existed on nomination day in September 2014. And then the second calculation is based on the number of electors on the voters list as it exists September 15th, 2018. And this calculation must be provided to candidates on or before September 25th, 2018. And whichever number of those two calculations is higher becomes the spending limit, and the clerk's calculation is final. Just going to skip over that one. So most expenses are subject to the spending limit. Those listed on the slide are not. So for example, audit and accounting fees, expenses related to a compliance audit, expenses related to a recount. Also, expenses related to fundraising functions are exempt from the campaign spending limit. However, in order for it to qualify as a fundraising function, an event must have the raising of money as the primary purpose. If that's okay, what I would say, yeah, if you guys don't mind, if you have a question, just maybe jot it down on the slide number and ask it at the end if that's okay. As I said, some of it may be clear based on the slides that are to come, so. Okay. All right, now we're going to move into campaign finance rules. So as a candidate, it's important to be fully aware of the responsibilities regarding election spending and accepting campaign contributions. So a question that we typically get asked at the ministry each election is whether there's a requirement for every candidate to have a chief financial officer, and the answer would be no. However, we do suggest that you familiarize yourself with the Municipal Elections Act and sections like 88.8 to 88.21. and also the financial statement forms, which, well, the form that we've been referring to, which is Form 4, which is the one you are required to file. And this is going to help guide you in how you would organize your records and understanding how it's going to be reported at the end of your campaign. You are required under the Municipal Elections Act to keep accurate records and open a campaign bank account if you're spending any money or accepting any contributions. We've already alluded to this. And any contributions you receive, they have to be deposited into that campaign account. However, as mentioned, bank accounts are only required or they're not required if you don't receive or spend any money. Continuing with the campaign finance rules, any contributions and expenses are to be accounted for and disclosed by the candidate on the relevant prescribed form. Again, Form 4. Candidates must keep records of receipts issued for every contribution, value of every contribution, whether contributions were in the form of money, goods, or services, etc. All candidates are required to keep all campaign financial records until November 15th, 2022, when a new council takes office. And these rules apply whether you are elected or not. I did allude to this earlier, but pass the hat donations, so those are donations under $25. They may be given anonymously, and they don't have to issue a receipt for those, and this is considered campaign income. It's not a contribution, and the total amount received must be reported on the campaign financial statements. And just as a note to that last point, although they can be given anonymously and you don't have to give a receipt, it's always a good idea to give receipts because you can actually put the contribution rules on there for those contributors. Here's some best practices for candidates. So I'll go through some or most of them here. Store receipts in a secure place. Receipts must be signed by the candidate or his or her designate. It's a good practice to have a receipt that's a multi-port form, so one for the contributor and one or more for your own records. Receipts should be sequentially numbered. You should open a bank account which provides monthly statements and canceled checks. You must produce, or you should produce duplicate deposit slips for every deposit, listing the names and of the contributors, and the amounts received from each. And as we've already mentioned, at the beginning of your campaign, candidates should familiarize themselves with the prescribed forms, so particularly the financial forms, Form 4 for candidates. And again, that's going to give you a better idea of what you need to know and the information you should know, which will make it easier to file at the end of your campaign. Okay, we're switching gears here a little bit. Just going to talk about campaign advertisements briefly. So candidates will be required to identify themselves on signs and advertisements. So for your reference, this is in the Municipal Elections Act, Section 88.3. And candidates must provide the following information to a broadcaster or publisher in writing. So the name of the candidate, the name, business address, and telephone number of the individual who deals with the broadcaster or publisher under the direction of the candidate. And no broadcaster or publisher shall cause an ad to appear unless they've been provided this information. So, as shown there on the slide, the broadcaster or publisher of a candidate advertisement shall maintain records containing the following information for a period of 4 years after the date the advertisement appears, and shall permit the public to inspect the records during normal business hours. So the first two bullets that are listed there are the information that the candidate needs to provide, which I talked about on the previous slide. But in addition to that, the broadcaster or publisher would need a copy of the advertisement, would need to provide a copy of the advertisement and how much they charge for that advertisement to appear. All right, moving back to more the finance side. So we're looking at financial statements. As we've already mentioned, all candidates will be required to file that Form 4 with the clerk, regardless of how much they spent or fundraised. And this is required under Section 88.25 of the Municipal Elections Act. And they must file this on or before 2 p.m. Friday, March 29th, 2019. If you filed a nomination form, you must file this Form 4, even if you withdrew your nomination or you were acclaimed, as we mentioned before. If you make a mistake, you may resubmit the financial statement to correct an error up until the deadline. The clerk is required to provide a public report of the candidates who filed their financial statements and those who did not. And if you feel you must, a candidate can apply to the courts for an extension to the March 29th deadline. If your expenses or contributions exceed $10,000, it is mandatory to appoint an auditor who will provide an auditor's report, mentioned this earlier, and the auditor must be licensed under the Public Accounting Act. It's also important to keep in mind that the clerk will make financial statements available to the public, meaning anybody can have a look and scrutinize them. So it's really important that you satisfy yourself that you have provided all the appropriate information in there and it is accurate as possible. More on financial statements. So candidates can file their financial documents at any time after voting day and before December 31st. And once they file them, their campaign period would end. And this is intended to make it easier for acclamations or when very little money was spent towards a campaign. Clerks will be required to report whether candidates have met the financial filing obligations. This report will be published on the municipal website or in some other electronic form. And this is something new, and it's important for the same reasons for the point I made earlier, which is that it's another level of scrutiny to your financial documents, so it's that much more important to make sure that they are as accurate as possible. The nomination fee is only refundable if the financial statements are filed on time, so again, on or before March 29th. As already mentioned, and a candidate who misses the filing deadline, they may file within a 30-day grace period, provided that they pay a $500 late filing fee. But keep in mind, if a candidate chooses to use that 30-day grace period, they're subject to the $500 late filing fee, and they also lose the refund of their associated with their nomination. Okay, looking at the surplus. So when filing the financial statements, a candidate with a campaign surplus must pay the entire amount to the clerk. However, prior to paying over the surplus funds to that clerk, a candidate is entitled to a refund of any contributions that they or their spouse made towards the campaign. And the clerk is required to place that surplus money into a trust for the use by the candidate if they need it for a compliance audit. And if the candidate does not require the funds for that purpose, it becomes the property of the municipality or the school board if it's applicable. Compliance audit process, so we're going to look at that now. Every council and school board must establish a compliance audit committee, and members of the compliance audit committee cannot be members of council or the school board. They can't be an employee. They can't be a candidate, or they can't be a registered third-party advertiser. The clerk is expected to review contributions and to prepare a report for consideration by the Compliance Audit Committee. This process relates to reviewing the actual financial statements that are filed, and it's not considered part of the compliance audit process. And if it's apparent to the clerk that the contributor has exceeded one or more of the contribution limits, the clerk would report this to the committee, which would meet to determine whether they want to proceed with any sort of legal action. The legislation doesn't specify what needs to go into this report that goes to the committee. And electors entitled to vote in an election may apply for a compliance audit, even if the candidate didn't file their financial statements at the end of their campaign. That application must be in writing, and it must set out the reasons for why that person believes that the Municipal Election Act was contravened. The application must be submitted to the municipal clerk or the secretary of the school board within 90 days of the filing deadline. The compliance audit will consider the the compliance audit committee will consider the application, and then they decide whether to retain an auditor to undertake a compliance audit of that candidate's financial return. Excuse me. Again, compliance audit. So the committee is required to provide brief written reasons for its decisions to conduct an audit, and the written reasons of the committee's decisions shall be circulated to the following: the candidate, the clerk with whom the candidate filed his or her nomination, the secretary of the school board, if that's applicable, and the applicant. And then if an audit actually occurs, the audit report will be circulated to those same individuals. If a compliance audit is undertaken, the committee will consider the auditor's report. And then the compliance audit committee meeting, it will be open to the public, but they can deliberate in private if they so choose. If the compliance audit determines that there was an apparent contravention of the MEA, the committee will decide whether they want to proceed with any sort of legal action. And those decisions of the committee can be appealed to the Superior Court of Justice. It's also important to note that any person who believes that a candidate has contravened the MEA, they do not have to go through an application process to the Compliance Audit Committee. They could go through some sort of legal action at any point in time. Sorry, folks, I think I missed skipping that slide. So this is a slide I just went over. I believe you guys have it in the packages. Okay, so this slide goes over the offenses under the MEA. So you cannot directly or indirectly offer, give, or promise to give any valuable consideration to influence an elector's vote. You can't offer money to convince somebody to run or not run for a particular office. And you can't give or offer a job to affect how someone either votes or whether they run or do not run for a particular office. And the following penalties would be applicable if you're convicted of one of the previous offenses under the Municipal Elections Act. And as an individual, maximum fine of $25,000, up to 6 months imprisonment, ineligibility to run in the next general election. And if you are a candidate, you could face all of those same penalties, plus fines for excess campaign expenses and forfeiture of office and if an offense is committed knowingly. And finally, if you're convicted of bribery, you may be ineligible to vote in the next general election. Okay, made it through those finance pieces. So Joan's going to come back up here and talk about the last section. Just 10 slides, so we should be able to get through it fairly quickly here and then open it up for question and answer.
So we're almost done. I'm just going to talk about the voters list, the voting proxies, scrutineers, and recounts. Then we'll open the floor for question. The preliminary list of electors as corrected by the clerk becomes the voters list. Although we have September 1st there, that is the weekend, so that it will become available September 4th, because the Monday, it's the Labor Day. So September 4th is when the voters list will become available. The clerk determines how and when individuals can apply to have their name and information corrected or added to or removed from the voters list. The clerk can also remove a name from the list if they become aware that a person has died. One copy of the voters list can be provided to each municipal candidate or trustee candidate. The request must be made to the clerk in writing. Candidates running in a ward are entitled to only the portion of the list that contains the names of electors entitled to vote for that office. Copies of the voters list are not available before September 1. I say it will be September 4th. The voters list shall not be posted in a public place. And also the voters list shall not be made available to the public by posting on an internet website or via any other print or electronic medium of mass communication. The clerk may require anyone who receives a copy of the list to sign a receipt acknowledging that the list is only going to be used for election purposes, and the list and any other use would be in violation of the Municipal Election Act. An elector's name shall appear only once on the list, and in a ward system, an elector is entitled to vote only in the ward where he or she resides. Voting proxy. There are a number of reasons why someone would appoint someone else to vote on their behalf, including absence from the area, illness, etc. A person who is entitled to be an elector in a local municipality may appoint another person who is also entitled to vote as their voting proxy. No proxy appointments can be made until nominations close. A voter must directly appoint another eligible voter by name as their proxy. A person may only act as the voting proxy for one person unless they are acting on behalf of a spouse, a child, a grandchild, a grandparent. The prescribed proxy form must be completed by the individual appointing the proxy. If the municipality is using alternative voting, you should verify with the clerk whether or not the voting proxy is permitted in the municipality. Scrutineers. Only a candidate may appoint a scrutineer to represent him or her during the voting and the counting of electors, including during a recount. The scrutineer must have written proof of authorization from the candidate. The clerk may require an oath of secrecy. During the regular election process, only one candidate or scrutineer is allowed per ballot box. Scrutineers are not permitted to touch ballots. There are no age restrictions for scrutineers, and also no campaigning is allowed within the voting place. So a useful tip for candidates who will be appointing a scrutineer is that you should check with the clerk to see if there is a list of scrutineers' rights. So if there is one, then the candidate will have to request for those rights and provide that to their scrutineers so they know their rights during the election period. A recount is automatic if the vote is tied. So in the event of a tie, a recount is automatic. So in addition to that, councils and school boards may establish policies during the election, setting out additional conditions for an automatic recount. Council may pass a resolution for a recount within 30 days after the clerk declares the election results. An eligible elector may apply to the Supreme Court of Justice for a recount within 30 days after the clerk declares the election results. In all instances, the recount must happen within 15 days after the 15 days of the clerk receiving a court order or the council passing a resolution to conduct a recount. Recount must be held in the same manner as the original count. So if the municipality is using a tabulator to count the votes, if there is a recount, they have to use the same process. They can't use a different process. So some key dates to keep in mind. You might want to print out this particular slide so you have the dates and be sure you're following all the deadlines. So the opening of nominations is May 1st. So that is when you file your nomination. And remember, you have to have your nomination form, which is Form 1, Form 2, which is 25 signatures, and then your filing fee. So those three things you will need as you go to file your nomination on May 1st. And nomination day is Friday, July 27th. Voting day is October 22nd, which is a Monday. And the candidate campaign period begins from when you file your nomination and closes Monday, December 31st. The campaign financial statement filing deadline is Friday, March 29, 2019. So keep in mind, I know at the beginning of our presentation, when we were talking about who is eligible to run for office or not. So if you don't file your campaign financial statement by the deadline, then you won't be able to run for office next election. So keep that in mind. So this is the resource slide we've been talking about, where you can have access to the various resources you need to be familiar with as you decide to continue in the election process. So the first link will take you to e-laws. So I know my colleague Sean also mentioned, if you're looking for a particular act, you can just go to your web browser and type in the act. It will still bring you back to the first link, which is the e-law. So that will take you to any law that you need to be familiar with. So some of those laws are the Municipal Election Act, the Municipal Act. If you're running for school board, the Education Act, and some other acts that you should be aware of. Then the second slide takes you to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs website. So with that link, you can have access to the candidates guide that we've been talking about and other materials that can provide some relevant information for you. So if you click on the second link, it will take you to the candidates guide, and if you read through the guide, which we encourage you to do, read through the candidates guide. There's a lot of information there you need to know, and there are a lot of examples to some of the questions you might have that we might not talk about today. So I encourage you to read the candidates guide, and there are links to each of these forms that you will be using throughout the process. So you click on the link, you download it, or you can also get those forms from your clerk. So with that, we come to the end of our presentation, and before I open the floor for questioning, again, we want to read out our disclaimer. I and Sean, we're not legal professionals. We're here to provide information about the election process, and you might have some specific questions, but we might not be able to provide responses to those like specific scenario questions. But like I said, we've provided the general rules that you should be aware of, and we are open to questions regarding all the information we've provided today. However, we may be unable to provide anything that might constitute as legal advice, and we understand this might cause some frustration, but we greatly appreciate your cooperation as we open the floor for questions. Thanks. Okay, we'll take him at the back.
Yes, slide 33, campaign expenses. Some clarification on point number, bullet number 2, the replacement value of any goods held in inventory from previous elections. This is, I would assume you're talking about election signs?
Yeah, signs or like office supplies or something like that.
So how do you value on signs that have gone through the wind and snow and everything else, and they're not in that great shape? So how do you value that?
Yeah, it would be on what the current market value would be of those goods. So if you were to replace them today, what it would cost. So you don't have to, it doesn't have to be the value of them, in terms of them like depreciating over that period of time.
Ask you to repeat.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So the question was related to if you're using goods from, say, a last election, such as campaign signs, how you would go about determining the fair market value, and it would basically be whatever the cost of if you were to buy those signs today. So you don't have to evaluate the cost of whether they've depreciated over time or something like that.
So a follow-up question. So if that's an expense, and you're not, say the signs are non-usable, it's still, you have to still claim that as an
No, if you're going to use them towards your campaign, yeah.
Okay, so then there's a double whammy. So there's the existing signs value that you place on whatever that may be, and then you purchase some new signs.
If you were going to use old signs and purchase new signs, so yes, so that you would have to account for those if they're used towards your campaign.
Yeah.
The dates set for the advance polls.
Sorry?
That would be, sorry, and the question was, are the dates set for the advance polls? I would refer you to Oakville for that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that will be talked about after the Q&A here.
Yeah, they're having a presentation after the question. Yeah.
A couple of questions. Similarly, on the third party, and I know we weren't specifically talking about that today, but this was obviously something that has changed because there was always money coming in. So if I had a corporation who wants to support my campaign specifically, they register as a third party and they can basically spend money to do bus shelters or whatever they want to do within
They have a spending limit. They do have a spending limit.
Is that laid out somewhere?
It's actually in the slides, so you should be able to find it there. We did skip over it just because, as we said at the beginning, we were just focusing specifically on.
Yeah, the
Yes.
rate is on the slide.
They have no self-funding limit, so they could basically fund all of it, but they can only spend a certain amount, and it's based on a formula. But yeah, you can see it in the, we don't need to go to it in the slide. It would be there in the deck there, so.
The other question I had is that assuming that the spending limit for the campaign is $32,000. So you're going to go ahead and all of a sudden, a month before, 2 months before the election dates, you hold a fantastic fundraiser and it raises $30,000. Am I understanding to say that that doesn't count into your limit? Because it's saying on here, the disclaimer is that fundraising of,
Well, you can raise as much money as you want. You can just only spend whatever the spending limit calculates out to.
just want to be clear on that.
Yeah.
You just said that it was not included.
Mhm.
Look at the rate.
No, yeah. So if you raise more money than you're allowed to spend, that's not a problem. But you will have that spending limit, so.
Can I clarify on that too? Just holding a fundraising event or activity is not included in your spending limits. So is that?
Yes. So there's still, and I think the confusion there which we get sometimes is that you have things that are considered expenses, but there's only certain things that are subject to the spending limit. Did you have yes. So there was a question related to fundraising functions, and you were asking if it was subject to the spending limit. And no, they would be things that are considered expenses, but they may not be subject to the actual spending limit.
So we can, just so I understand it properly, we could spend $100,000 to raise the money. Even though am I understanding correctly? We can spend money, gobsmacks of money to raise it.
Well, no, it would have to meet the and asking, can you spend an exorbitant amount of money to raise money, but it would have to meet the definition of what is considered a fundraising function.
And that's in the legislation.
And yeah, it would, and we talked about it. It should be somewhere in the slide deck as well.
Can I just comment on that? You also, if you raise more money through the fundraising functions that you are not able to spend, then that becomes the property of the municipality.
Yeah. The question isn't about the amount that you raise as opposed to how much you can spend to raise the money and how that affects your spending limit for the overall campaign.
You have a set limit, which you will be provided at the time that you register.
Yes.
You'll get your interim and your financial. We will cover all this in the Oakville piece that's coming up. But you are subject to your expense limit under all circumstances. So it may not be considered your fundraising for your fundraising campaign, but like I say, if you raise more money than you're eligible to spend, then that becomes a surplus and that becomes the property of the municipality.
I'll wait for the
You know what, the problem is, it says here, holding a fundraising event or an activity's expense not subject to the limit. So that's the question. If you spend like $100,000 to throw a giant pizza party, is that money not part of the spending?
We won't be able to give a binary answer. It's basically what it says there. It's the costs associated. Well, let me actually read what it says on the slide if we can find it. 38? Okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, perfect. Yep, so, yeah, holding a fundraising event or activity. And I think I had read a point earlier that the primary purpose has to be for raising money. I don't have the slide right here in front of me. Yeah. So, but again, I can't give like really binary answers to any scenarios, but
So here I have, it says, expenses related to fundraising functions are exempt from the campaign spending limit. But in order to qualify as a fundraising function, an event must have the raising of money as its primary purpose.
and yeah.
So you can spend $50,000. If your spending limit is $50,000, I could spend $60,000 on the raising of money and still have $50,000 that is my spending limit.
I think
Yeah.
so.
Yes.
Well, again, yeah, we don't, we,
Understanding that
yeah.
that's not legal advice.
No, I know. That's why we have a double disclaimer.
Okay.
Can we just park this until the Oakville, because you guys are busy things all over. We just
Okay.
wait until the Oakville presentation, quite clear for once the Oakville presentation.
Good.
We will, we'll stick around. If there is any questions that people want to approach us after the session, we'd be happy to chat with them, so.
Just a few questions. The last session was videotaped. Is this videotaped also?
This session is being videotaped,
So it will be available on the website?
and it will be available on the website tomorrow at some point.
Second question is that May 1st is the beginning when we can submit, and it's still the July 27th?
Yeah, that's right.
In terms of filing your nomination?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
because you called it nomination date, so I didn't know it.
So the question
yeah.
was just around clarifying when you can file your nomination.
So the window is from May 1st to...
July 27, yeah.
Just one quick question.
Yep.
Directly to you folks. How are you progressing with the student vote? I know it's a new thing for 2018. Students are able to come and vote. There obviously, it doesn't count towards the election, but it's going to be recorded. Is that something that you're working with the school trustees on? Is that something that
Yep.
was perceived but won't be happening? I'm just interested to know that.
That's a good question. I think it may be outside of the scope of our presentation because I'm not sure what the answer would be. You can either refer to our information at the end of the slide and send us an email, but it also may be a good question for the school board secretary.
Yeah.
There's one quick question. So if you spend more than 10,000, you have to hire someone to audit?
Yeah, I'll read it off to you if we can find the actual section. We like to refer to the wording as it's
It'll be there.
in our slides.
In our notes.
Which
It should be,
slide is that?
yeah, it should be that one. Yeah, right.
Here we go. Yep. The appointment of an auditor by a candidate is mandatory if the expenses or contributions exceed $10,000. All right. I think we'll continue on then and allow Town of Oakville to take over. Thank you, everybody. Again,
Thank
we will
you.
be available after Oakville's presentation if you guys think of any other questions.
Andrea is now going to present the Oakville portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Sean and Joan, for that presentation. I did just want to clarify that we actually won't be getting into any more of the financial aspect of it. That's why the ministry was here. We as election administrators have to interpret the legislation just as voters and candidates do as well. But the ministry is your best bet if you do have particular questions, or of course you can obtain legal advice yourself. Okay, so a ward boundary change and an increase to council composition was approved by council in 2016. After the 2018 election, Oakville will have a council of 15, 14 councillors and 1 mayor. Electors will be voting in October based on these new wards. So as you can see, we have a new Ward 7 north of Dundas Street. More information on the ward boundary review and the boundary descriptions can be found online at oakville.ca. And a link is provided on the elections website. So what to expect? So as of Tuesday, May 1st, people have the ability to file their nomination papers. Once you've made the decision to run for office, you will want to ensure that you schedule an appointment with the clerk and bring in the appropriate documentation with you. So that includes the completed notice of nomination, Form 1, at least 25 signatures of endorsements. So we are stressing to get a few more than 25, just in case any of the signatures are contested. It's a good practice to have a few more in your back pocket that you can submit with your papers. And all the signatures do have to be original signatures. We can't accept any faxes, photocopies, or scans. Alongside the other 2 documents, you have to bring in the declaration of qualification form, and that has to be signed in front of the clerk. Of course, the filing fee has to be paid, $200 for office of mayor and $100 for all other offices. And proper identification is required. So we are suggesting a driver's license showing your qualifying address. So there was a couple questions raised with Sean and Joan that were more applicable to the Oakville part. So advanced voting dates will be provided upon filing your nomination. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. A candidate package will be given to you. We like to sit down with all candidates for about 20 to 30 minutes, and we have a complete package with a lot of information, including a candidate guide. Advanced voting dates, they're tentatively scheduled, but we will be providing them to the public no later than August on the website. Also, when you file your paper, you will receive your interim certificate of maximum campaign expenses, so that you will get upon filing of your registration. An amendment to Schedule D of the sign bylaw was recently approved by Council just back in April 3rd. At this time, I would like to introduce John Maddox, Supervisor of Parking Operations, to provide the group a brief overview of this recent amendment, as well as a high-level review of election signs.
Thanks, Andrea. As Andrea mentioned, so my name is John Maddox. I'm the Supervisor of Parking Control. We will be taking over the enforcement of election signs this year. Okay. More information will be included in your candidate package that you do receive from the Clerk's Department. It will include maps of exactly where the signs can be placed on what roads. It'll include the deposit form and a letter just highlighting some key points to remember. So your deposit, the election sign deposit must be submitted before any election signs can be placed on municipal road allowance. The deposit is $200. If signs are placed before an election sign deposit is paid, the signs will be removed. The signs will be available for pickup at a location that will be shared with you folks soon. And there will be potentially fees to pick up those signs. And no signs may be erected prior to September 7th, 2018. That doesn't mean that you can't purchase your signs before that date. Once you have registered and have your accounts open, you would be able to purchase signs. You just can't display them. So for sign placement, election signs can only be placed on arterial road allowances. In your package, we will include maps of every ward and the streets that they are allowed. Signs are prohibited on municipal property, including community and recreation centers, parks, and on road allowances abutting any town-owned building. An example of an arterial road could be Rebecca, Spears, Cornwall Road, and Lakeshore. So signs cannot be placed on town trees or tree supports. They can't be placed on utility poles, official signs or official sign structures. So an example could be a street sign. They can't be placed on town fences or regional roadways. An example of approved sign supports. So we are recommending wooden posts that are 2 inches by 2 inches or less. The other option is metal posts that are 1/4 inch diameter or less. So an example of those could be the bag signs that you get. Those would be approved. What's not approved is the steel T-bars that you typically need a hammer to get into the ground. Those can damage underground wires or communication cables, and can pose a safety hazard for those putting them in or taking them out. As you've heard, so third-party election signs are allowed, but they may not be displayed on property of a voting location at any time during established voting hours. So you'd want to make sure that you do cover that with the folks that you're assisting your campaign. And this year, we will be taking complaints. They will be handled through Service Oakville. So you can call the main Town of Oakville number, or you can email Service Oakville, and they will dispatch a parking control officer to investigate the concern, and if need be, to remove any signs that are in violation of the bylaw. And like I said before, so signs will be made available for pickup. The location will most likely be north of Dundas at our North Operations Facility. And there will be, during the election, there will be a fee of $50 that can be deducted from the sign deposit to pick up during the election. And after the election, 72 hours after, if we have to pick up any signs that are left out on municipal roadways, there'll be a charge of $10 per sign. And that's 3 days after the election. And so that was just a quick high-level overview. There will be more information coming in your packages and at the August candidate meeting. But if you have any questions that I can help you with, yes?
John, one of the issues I had with townhomes and townhouses with the lawn signs
Mhm.
and I guess the town property or easements is very, very, it's not part of it.
It's-
So we put them in and with the intention that they're very close to the house
Mm-hmm.
and the town came along and scooped them all up. Can we not make some kind of discretionary case with respect, because there's not a lot of property on these townhomes or townhouses that, because a lot of people don't know where that defining line is.
Yeah.
And they have a little piece of grass and they think it's theirs. So can we have some consideration with respect to signing that and taking from that?
Yeah, so that's going to be more of an internal policy for our staff, that we're going to kind of educate them. For small mistakes, we're not going to be too concerned about that. But for the ones that maybe pose a safety issue, too close to intersections, we would probably act a bit differently on those ones. Yes, sir. Yeah, so they can go on a resident's front lawn. That's okay. Yep. Yes, sir.
So if you have a private company that has a business, let's say, for example, in Oakville, and they want to put a sign or a sticker inside their business that's supporting you and their property, and that you pay for that, is there any issues with that?
It's private property. I don't believe so, but I can confirm that for you. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Over the road, that part of the grass from the sidewalk, walkway, is public property in front of my house.
So yeah, usually anything between the sidewalk and a roadway is town property. Some tips that we'll share later: if you see a utility pole on your front lawn, typically that's town property between that and the roadway. Yeah.
Can put a sign there or only on the private property?
So only on the private property, but if it's just a small mistake where it's kind of close, it would most likely be okay. Yes.
I guess just a point of clarification on the townhome piece. Where it's a home that doesn't have a sidewalk in front of it.
Okay.
There's some areas that sidewalks only on one side.
Yep.
So is that from the road to that tree that is typically planted? Is that considered?
Yeah, it's roughly about 1.5 meters. So in those scenarios, you're probably looking at about 1.5 meters from the roadway.
Probably on, yeah, so probably
Yeah.
should be on that tree.
Yeah, in that area. Got it. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And like I said, more detailed info and maps will be included in your candidate package.
And just a couple things that I wanted to clarify. So signs, whether on public or private property, no signs can be erected prior to September 7th or prior to the deposit being paid. And also, third-party advertiser signs and candidate signs, they are required to follow the same rules as outlined in the bylaw. Okay, so we are going to move along to request for information. So should you have questions or inquiries about anything related to Oakville services or operations where such information is not readily available on the website, A request for information form must be submitted. The intent of this is to eliminate duplication, maximize efficient use of staff resources, and to ensure that all candidates or potential candidates are granted access to the same information. When the questions are received, the questions and answers will be compiled and they will be available on the election website. So Sean and Joan referenced that municipalities are required to have a procedure with regards to the use of corporate resources. We have had one in effect. Oakville has had one procedure in effect for quite some time now, but it has been updated recently and it was received by council in April. With few exceptions, as noted in the procedure, no one, including candidates, third parties, members of council, and staff, may use town resources for election campaign purposes. So with this in mind, just a few things to note. Campaign materials may not be displayed at town facilities. So pamphlets, brochures, they can't be left at customer service desks or at snack bar counters. The corporate logo, the corporate logo, crest, coat of arms, slogan, or other corporate identifiers is permitted only for use by the corporation of the town of Oakville and shall not be used for any other purposes, particularly relating to election campaign purposes. And with the exception of town hall, municipally owned or run facilities may now be rented in accordance with standard rental fees and agreements. This is a new update to the procedure, and as long as the standard rental fees and agreement procedures are followed, town facilities, with the exception of town hall, can be rented for campaign purposes. Yes.
So any campaign materials could be used during that rent period?
So campaign materials, they may be brought in, but they would be restricted to the allotted rental area and the allotted rental time. Yeah.
And existing councillors currently that are running for election, are they using corporate logos?
They would not. They would also have to follow the rules as outlined in the procedure.
So that if they have existing websites with those logos, would they have to take them off during the campaign period?
Of course, yes. And now any current members of council registering as a candidate, they would be required to establish their own website for election campaign purposes, separate from what Oakville.ca offers, if that's what you meant. Yes.
You can't use any human resources within.
Absolutely, yeah. So use of staff is identified in the procedure as well, and the procedure is available online. I'm happy to direct anyone to it should they wish. Any other questions about that? Sorry? It depends where you are. It doesn't depend who you are, it depends which room and which facility. Okay, so an information session will be held in August for certified candidates, and this will be it'll be a similar style to this, but we will go into a lot more detail. Being April, the election being October, we didn't want to overwhelm or provide too much information ahead of time, but we did wanted to offer some high-level information. And details of the time and date of this will be provided at a later date. The information also will be live streamed and available on our website for those candidates who are potentially off on summer holidays. So topics to be reviewed include scrutineers, signs, financials again, voting locations, advanced voting dates and times, and the voters list and results reporting. So while the Municipal Elections Act and literature published by the province, as well as the information that we will provide to you upon registering your nomination papers, that literature should be your first starting point, but please don't hesitate to contact any one of us should you have questions or concerns. Obviously, in terms of interpreting legislation, we will suggest that you do get legal advice if you so wish, but we're happy to answer questions that you may have where possible. So I'd like to thank once again the Minister of Municipal Affairs advisors, Joan and Sean, for coming tonight and providing us this important information, as well as the election team and John Maddox from parking. Everybody provided some great information to you tonight, and some great questions were asked as well. I'm going to open up the floor once again for any questions, should anyone have any. Looks like we may have answered them all, though. Yes.
Just what file format do the electoral list come in?
I believe we provide it in an Excel format so that you have the ability to manipulate and sort and filter. Is that correct?
And I'm not sure if it's up on the site at the moment, but is there a poll-by-poll results for past elections?
Yes, yeah. So past election information is available. I believe so, yes. Yep. So in 2014, we went to a vote anywhere within your ward model, but it still lists the voting locations and the results by location. And that's all on elections.oakville.ca.
As Andrea just said, we went to a vote anywhere within your ward in 2014, and it will be the same process for 2018, so we don't actually have polls. We don't need them because within each ward you can go anywhere. So our results are usually reported by candidate and by location. There is also open data where we post data from previous elections. It's on our open data website, and we also have it posted in the past elections section of the website.
Should anyone wish to make an appointment to file their papers after May 1st or after or on May 1st, feel free to give us a call in the clerk's department and we can help you out. Okay. Thank you for coming tonight.